During the coronavirus pandemic, Asian Americans rose to answer the call as frontliners, caregivers, cure seekers, truth tellers, providers, and modern-day heroes. Can't enough about how grateful and proud we are of you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Madeline Milka, President and CEO of Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies, otherwise known as APACS. Just wanted to welcome you tonight for this very thoughtful discussion that we're about to have. Just wanted to give you also a little bit more information about APACS. We were co-founded in 1994 by former Secretary Norman Y. Mineta when he served as a member of Congress. And as a member of Congress, he also co-founded the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, CAPAC, of which we're its educational arm. And we're proud to say that there are 20 AAPI members of the United States House of Representatives and United States Senate. So we are at a record high in terms of AAPI members in Congress. Our programs were created to fulfill the mission of promoting AAPI participation and representation at all levels of the political process, from community service to elected office. And as APACS continues to bring more programming, we look forward to partnering with organizations such as API Vote at its National AAPI Leadership Summit so that we can discuss how the AAPI community is growing its influence as elected officials. Tonight, we're honored to have elected officials from across the country talk with us about the work that they're doing to build allyship with marginalized communities. Moderating this panel is Bobby Cannon-Calvin, and he is a Florida-based government and politics reporter for the Associated Press. Over his long career in journalism, he has worked for such outlets as the Boston Globe, the Detroit Free Press, and the Sacramento Bee. He has covered the US Congress, the presidential race, the war in Iraq, and the return of the San Francisco Giants to the World Series in 2010. Calvin is a member of the board of directors for the Asian American Journalists Association. So we appreciate him moderating this panel and all of our distinguished panelists tonight.
Thank you so much, Madeline. Along with our panelists and our distinguished panelists, we hope to have a very engaging conversation tonight or this afternoon, depending on where you're beaming in from. As you all know, we are in the midst of some of the most challenging times that our country has faced, but it's also a time for change and opportunity. And we're about to get into a double-barreled discussion, how the death of George Floyd rippled from Minneapolis to the rest of the country, actually around the world, inspiring calls for equality, and how the Black Lives Matter movement is reverberating across communities, including our own AAPI communities. As we grapple with identity, race, and equality, we're also trying to weather this great public health pandemic that we're in. Not only are we worried about our own health and staying healthy, the coronavirus outbreak has spawned anti-Asian sentiments across America. And today's political climate sometimes appear to be stoking some of that negativity. Leading us in today's conversation are Minnesota State Representative Samantha Vang. Representative Vang is in her first term in the Minnesota State House and was elected in 2018, representing Minnesota House District 40B. She chairs the Minnesota Asian Pacific Caucus. Also joining us is Kentucky State Representative Nima Kulkarni. Representative Kulkarni was elected in 2018 as well, and is Kentucky's first House member of Indian ancestry. She represents the 40th District in Louisville, which includes the University of Louisville and Churchill Downs. And also joining us, San Jose City Councilman Lan Diep. Councilman Diep has served on his city council since 2016 when he won his seat by 12 votes. His focus has been on economic development, building affordable housing, improving transportation options, and smarter land use. But let's start, first of all, in Minnesota with State Representative Samantha Vang, who will take us to her communities in Minneapolis to describe how the death of a Black man, George Floyd, became the latest rallying cry for the Black Lives Movement. I'm hoping, Representative Vang, you might bring us up to speed on what the latest developments are.
Sorry, I have to unmute myself. Thank you, Bobby, and thank you, Apex, for hosting this panel and helping us have this important conversation to the greater API community and to everyone else out there. I'm State Representative Samantha Vang. I represent District 40B, Brooklyn Center, Brooklyn Park, which is the first ring of suburbs bordering Minneapolis. And we know that the world is watching us right now. What we do here matters, and how we move forward as a country and as a state. And when the murder of George Floyd occurred, we were already at the end of session. Our session ended at the legislature around mid-May, May 18th. And shortly afterwards, the murder of George Floyd happened. And that is the Posse Caucus. Not only am I chair of the Minnesota Asian Pacific Caucus, but I'm also a member of the People of Color Indigenous Caucus. And 2018 is a historic election for many communities of color because that was the first time we have enough critical mass at the legislature of legislators of colors who are able to push a racial equity lens agenda. And the murder of George Floyd, unfortunately, really was able to propel us into a momentum of setting a really dramatic change in how we do police accountability and police reform. And so since day one, when George Floyd got murdered till now, we've been working, the Posse members and I, and supporters of the DFL caucus have been working every day nonstop to look at legislation. And these are legislation that are not new. These are legislations that we've been working on before I was even elected in office, because police brutality is nothing new. And these are legislation that has been worked on, has been initiated by the community. And now we are at a point where we have enough critical mass at the legislature to really create that change. And we got into the governor called us back into a special session on June 12th. Yes, if I remember correctly. We were in the midst of negotiations. And unfortunately, in order for us to really create the change that we want to see, we got to have white people be in support of this too. And unfortunately, Minnesota is the only state in the country that's in a divided legislature. And the Republicans are in the majority in the Senate, and they were unwilling. In fact, they had no respect for us to acknowledge our agenda. And so
Representative Vang, before we get into some of the details of those things, let's again get people up to speed as to what the latest is as far as the what happened to the police officer who basically put a knee on Mr. Floyd's neck and suffocated him. So just bring us up to speed with just the latest developments for now.
Yes, I mean, Officer Derek Chauvin and the rest of the other officers involved are arrested. They are going through the process, and we are making sure that this process is thorough and expeditious. And so that is what we're doing at the legislature. We are continuing to work on our legislation to push our agenda to ensure there's police accountability and ensure that and change the culture of how the police departments are shaped in our state.
Of course, when Mr. Floyd died, it captured the country's attention. Many of us were understandably appalled. But as an Asian American, I happen to be of Filipino descent, I really worried about the repercussions in our communities when I learned that one of the officers who stood by to watch his fellow officer's knee suffocate Mr. Floyd was of Asian descent. How did the AAPI community in Minnesota and the Hmong community in particular react to that news?
Yeah, it's been a mixed response. I think when Officer Tutao, when the community found out that Officer Tutao is involved as well, you know, in the wake of COVID-19, there's already been a great sense of anti-Asian sentiment. And Tutao is a common name in the Hmong community. In the Hmong community, there are only 18 last names, and Tu is a very common name, just like there are many Samanthas out there. And when people in the middle of social media, it's easier to look up Tutao and see if they're from the Twin Cities. And many of members of our community have gotten death threats and have been stalked and have been faced with a lot of cyber bullying. So that was, it's really quite an emotional response from everyone in the country. And however, of course, everyone agrees that what Derek Chauvin did was wrong, and that the officers who were involved should have intervened. And so everyone, but there's been a mixed response about whether Officer Tutao should have should be in the same fate as Derek Chauvin. And that's more of a mixed response, more of a in terms of a generational divide. The younger folks see that and believe, along with me, that what Officer Tutao did was wrong, and he was complicit in that murder of George Floyd. However, our parents or elders, they felt that Officer Tutao should not face the same fate and should have more compassion in that sense. And so in that sense, there's been a mixed response in what has transpired.
So in light of the racial friction in Minnesota because of the George Floyd case, I'm wondering what some of the efforts might have transpired that tried to bridge any kinds of divides racially to make sure that, you know, anti-Asian sentiments don't intensify or fester. What outreach might have been made by the Asian American community and the African American communities to make sure that there was as much harmony as possible?
Yes, definitely. I mean, there's been more calls for solidarity. When we are in a tough time and we feel a lot of more tensions within communities of color. And it is my job to use my platform to bring unity and to see the larger vision, the larger goal, that this is not a fight between us. This is a fight towards against white supremacy, against the racism, against America's original sin that started all of this. And so it's my job to remind everyone that when the country is at its worst, we have to be our best. And that's what has been helpful, I feel, to make sure that everyone stays together and that we're all in this together.
All right. So we will return to Minnesota, but now let's turn to Kentucky and State Representative Nima Kulkarni. Even before George Floyd, there was Breonna Taylor, a Black woman who was killed in March by Louisville police. The 26-year-old American emergency room technician died after police barged into her apartment. Shots were fired, and Ms. Taylor was killed. Of course, that's a major oversimplification of the incident, particularly in a very complex country that we live in, when we have to deal with race relations. Representative Kulkarni, I'm wondering if you might describe some of those complexities in Louisville and what is underway to bring some kind of understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to put some of the historical context of Louisville into play here, because it's one of the most historically segregated cities geographically. So you've got the West End, which is primarily African American, and as you move further east, it's predominantly white. And the very east end of our city is like almost completely white, very suburban. And in terms of transportation, buses don't go there. It's very difficult to get there. So there's a lot of different barriers that have been put in place forever, right? This is since the start of our city on purpose, and nobody's fixed it. And so those issues have just compounded themselves. And so what you've got also is the difference in the way our police treat those areas. So if you go to the East End, you're not going to find police treating citizens the way they do in the West End. And so what happened in this situation is you've got, and it brings into play the use of things like no-knock warrants. There's no way a no-knock warrant would have been executed and implemented in the East End. That would just not happen. And unfortunately, we all know it in Louisville, but it's something that needs to be understood. There are a lot of cities in America like this, but that has really highlighted the disparities, the racial disparities, disparities in how police treat their citizens, and how violently sometimes that difference impacts our community. And I think what happened is a situation where there was it's been talked about, there's a clerical error on the no-knock warrants. The judge shouldn't have signed it because it was just sort of copy pasted, and it was the wrong information, the wrong name. They didn't announce themselves. Breonna Taylor's boyfriend, thought they were being broken into. He had a gun. And so it was just a sequence of tragic events that really did not need to happen, and honestly would not have happened if it was in another part of town. And that is something that I think is important to remember. But that it's also brought into focus the training, right? What warrants a no-knock warrant? In what situations is it appropriate? And it's already very narrowly defined. And this was a situation where it should not have been executed. It should not have been signed by a judge. But it wasn't questioned. So you have this warrant that had information from maybe months ago that had not been updated. Nobody checked down the line. It was signed by a judge, and then it was implemented by officers. So you've got a situation where officers are saying, well, this is what was on the warrant, and we did what we thought we needed to do because we thought we were in danger. So it's highlighting a whole broad spectrum of issues that go beyond one incident. And I think that's happening across the country because there's been just years and years and decades of this sort of disparate treatment in these communities. And now, maybe because of COVID, maybe because this is just it. This is the last straw, maybe because there's a lot of rhetoric. Everything is politicized. Do I wear a mask? Do I not wear a mask? I mean, everything is a statement about where you stand on the political spectrum. And so you've got protesters in Louisville that have been out every single day, justice for Breonna, say her name, these movements, and they have not slowed down. And I think, it was 3 months before anybody picked up on this story. It was not that this incident happened and then immediately everybody knew about it. And so why were we not talking about this when it happened? Because people just hoped it would go away, or, that whole, the way it was treated is also something that we need to, on a leadership level, on a systemic level on down. So it's implicating literally everybody, from officers to leaders to folks on the street.
And of course, there have been many other stories that predates George Floyd. I mean, we can all go back to the 1990s with Rodney King, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get to Rodney King later. But I'm curious for now. There aren't many AAPIs in Kentucky, and I'm wondering how you got to where you are. How did you forge alliances and win election in your district? I mean, in fact, you beat out a white incumbent on your way to win your own seat 2 years ago, and you're the first Indian American to win a seat in Kentucky's House of Representatives. How do you do that? I mean.
So I just very quickly, I actually won my re-election on Tuesday against the same incumbent that I beat 2 years ago.
Congratulations.
And it was, and I'm not bringing that up to sort of yay me, but the margins, it was about 80-20. And, in a district, so my district, there's not a lot of immigrants. There's not a lot of, and I'm the first immigrant. So I was born in India. So that's a first for Kentucky as well, from anywhere. And I think it shows that the fact that my district elected me, which is predominantly, you mentioned I have the University of Louisville at Churchill Downs. It's predominantly white and black, right? No immigrants. It's a mix of younger people, professionals, and then a lot of older folks that have lived in these houses for generations. And it's Democratic, heavily Democratic, but there's very, very conservative Democrats and there's very, very liberal Democrats. And I think what won the election for me is literally knocking on every single door that I could. And the fact that I was willing to just go out there and talk to people and say, look, something is not right. This is not the time for folks to be MIA in our legislature. There are a lot of our values that are under attack. And that was what it was, is real shoe leather type stuff. And we had, of course, 1 million yard signs out, but it was just door knocking. And if I could talk to people, I could convince them that, nobody really asked. That's the other thing. Nobody really asked. Oh, and we were very concerned. What do I put my first name, which is Nima, very easy to remember? Do we just leave out the last name, which is confusing, and they may not remember how to spell it? But it was fine. Nobody questioned any of that, and nor did they question who is this strange person just kind of knocking at my door. And I think that is literally what did it last time. And I think this time, it's just the way I've voted, the way I've shown up and actually done, tried to do. We're in a super minority here in Kentucky, so there's not a whole lot of power that we wield, but at least we can speak out, against those that are going to hurt our constituents. But it is interesting. It is interesting because I think Kentucky, and I'm sure folks were watching our Senate primary, Charles Booker and Amy McGrath, who are going to face off against, who Amy McGrath won, but she's going to face off against Mitch McConnell. And Charles Booker represented something that I think folks that I sort of embody as well, is a change in the face of Kentucky politics, right? I think people are ready. They were ready for it in 2018. I think they are even more ready for it this year.
Now, as Louisville and the rest of Kentucky address race relations, and let's be honest, it's mostly been, as you said, in terms of black and white, because that's the majority of the population there. What kinds of allyships have been fostered, and how have you, as a person of Asian descent, been perceived in the work of finding common ground between, the larger communities?
Yeah, and I've been kind of adopted by our Black Legislative Caucus. They have been very, very supportive of me. We're hopeful that myself and the only other woman of color, who's a Black woman, Attica Scott, have started a Women of Color Caucus, which is aspirational because it's just the two of us right now. But they have been incredibly supportive of me, and I may not be Black, but I am a person of color, and that is vanishingly rare in our Kentucky legislature. Hopefully it's changing. But that is something that has been a bridge that has allowed me to make a lot of connections in the legislature, has helped me with just the experience that they have. These are folks that have been around for years, that know Frankfurt, and know how to, pass bills, how to work with the other side, and have been just nothing but supportive. And I would not be able to have done any of the things that I did do without them. And one of those things was, we had a bill, Senate Bill 1 this last session, which was it was an anti-sanctuary city bill, but went way further, and basically would allow local law enforcement to become immigration officers with no training, no funding, and they would, essentially expand policing to our local communities. And we've got a lot. Louisville, for its size, has a lot of refugees, because we have 3 different refugee resettlement agencies, 2 of which are in Louisville and around Kentucky. But we've got, Black immigrants, we've got Asian immigrants, we've got white immigrants, we've got brown immigrants, and it's a mixed bag. And I think a lot of people need to understand that it's not just about one color anymore. It is not about white and Black. It's about, if you are incapable of preventing harm in the systemic injustice that exists, we are all, vulnerable, and we are all looked at the same way by the establishment. And I think that we that bill wasn't heard. I had a lot of very meaningful conversations with folks on the other side about the harm it would do. And I think because it's weird in Kentucky, you kind of walk this line, you're not white and you're not Black. So I think people are just kind of like, where are you coming from? So I'll take a minute to listen, because I'm not just going to dismiss you out of hand, because I just am genuinely curious. And I think there was a lot of that as well. But these protests have also highlighted that, because it's not just Black people out there, right? It's not just Black people, and it's not just white allies either. There's a lot of folks that are Hispanic, that are Asian, that are from, a lot of different countries, or just from a lot of different, their parents come from a lot of places, or grandparents, because I think that's been highlighted here, that we're all kind of in this together, and we're all vulnerable if we don't fix the system.
Well, let's move over to the West Coast, to the many hundreds of miles away, and seemingly very far away from the epicenters right now of this racial divide. But the Black Lives Matter movement, of course, is nationwide, and has had a very strong presence in a progressive place like the San Francisco Bay Area. In Santa Clara County, the southern tip of Silicon Valley, Blacks make up less than 3% of the 2 million people who live there. AAPIs make up about 40% of the county's population, and Latinos make up a fourth. So when you, councilman, when you scan the faces of the people in the crowds of San Jose's Black Lives Matter demonstrations, I would imagine that they're not mostly Black, right? Much like the representative just said in her communities. Who are they in your community? Describe them for us.
Yeah, sure. So there certainly are members of the African-American community showing up. You're right, in San Jose, it's about 3% African-American, but they showed up, and it was a diverse crowd. We had Latinos, we had white people, we had Indian descent, we had Vietnamese and Chinese. I really think it was a diverse coalition of people who were rightfully outraged by the murder of George Floyd, and they showed up to declare that Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, I'm wondering, when you saw those diverse faces, and this atmosphere of inclusion, what did that tell you about the movement?
I think that it spoke to a tipping point, right? I think what was most commented on nationally, and it was certainly here in San Jose, that these Black Lives Matter protests are not new. They've happened for many years, continuing on with many occurrences of Black lives taken needlessly throughout the recent history of the United States. But this time, the difference was that you saw a lot more white faces. You saw a lot of people who weren't Black, who weren't people of color. And I think, as other commentators have made the point, that matters, that kind of mainstreamed the movement in a sense. There were many people I've heard share stories that were just there as observers, or wanting to get their children and their family engaged civically for the first time. And this is their kind of entry point into activism, into politics. And so that was certainly the case in San Jose. And the protest happened not just over one weekend, but over many days. They're still ongoing. I think there were some people organizing outside City Hall even as we were getting on this webinar.
Yeah. Well, I'm also wondering though, because the movement has sort of morphed into all sorts of micro movements. Um, has there been anything in San Jose that has sort of coalesced with the Black Lives movement that might be more, not necessarily more meaningful, but more, and I'm trying to choose the right word here because any word I use is going to be taken with a little bit of criticism here, but a little bit more relevant to our communities, meaning, perhaps the Vietnamese community, Filipino community, or other AAPI communities.
I think in terms of AAPI centric movements, I have yet to see anything take root. I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe I just haven't seen it yet, but nothing prevalent that has risen to my level of attention. I think we're certainly seeing a lot more Asian people get involved with the defund the police movement. The city council dealt with that during budget season. And I got hundreds, if not thousands, of emails, and I looked through the various emails. Mainly, it was 3 emails sent hundreds of times, but the names of the people sending them were certainly many more of Asian descent that I typically get on any standard council meeting item.
Yeah, and this is a question for all of our panelists here, because there is some sensitivity on this issue. It's Black Lives Matter, not all lives matter, right? But I'm wondering, where as a community do we enter the discussion so that it benefits our communities? And how sensitive of an issue is it for us to sort of hitch our wagon to this movement right now, the Black Lives movement?
I think it's quite sensitive if you're talking about within the Asian community. And
yeah. How do we as Asian Americans,
sure,
and again, I'm trying to be as sensitive here as possible, benefit
sure
from this broader movement that might focus on Black lives at this moment?
So I think it's important to recognize that whatever benefits Black America benefits Asian America. The Black community has suffered many indignities for the color of their skin that, quite frankly, the Asian community has not. And to the extent that they have succeeded and they have persevered and broken down barriers, that has been to the benefit of me, of the Vietnamese community, other Asian communities, and so we owe them that debt of gratitude. I think the narrative of race in America has always been black and white. It's been binary, zeros and ones. And as Asian Americans, we aren't. It's not that we don't face racism ourselves. We do, absolutely. We have our own issues and barriers to overcome, but we are able to move back and forth on the spectrum of whiteness and blackness accordingly. Sometimes we're the other, we're immigrants, we're not white enough, but then in other times we're held up as a model minority and we're not Black. And so we're held up as this image of look at the Asians, look at what they can do. Why can't you, these other groups, be like that, be good immigrants, quote unquote, right? So certainly, to the extent that the Black Lives Matter movement succeeds and they're able to further break down racial barriers and achieve more equality, it's to the benefit of everybody, AAPIs included. I think internally within the Asian community, there is a generational divide, right? And I said that I'm getting a lot of emails with Asian surnames, demanding equality and talking about defund the police. I don't know, but I would venture to guess that those are people under 40. That's my guess. I don't know for certain, but I would make that wager. And there are people my parents' age who are elder, who are the people who emigrated here, who weren't born here, that maybe are less comfortable with the Black Lives Matter movement, who see the looting on TV and see the car windows being broken and see that as disdainful, and see the police taking action to keep storefronts and protect people as desirable, and who don't quite understand the anger that the younger generation is feeling, who don't feel the allyship with Black lives. That's going on. And I think internally there is a debate, a generational debate to be had between the younger generation and our parents about what's going on in America and where we fall in all that. So even among the APIs, it's not monolithic.
Well, let me go back to Representative Vang, who I want to ask you an earlier question about the faces that you saw in the crowds with demonstrations and so forth. How many of those faces were from the Hmong community or the Asian American community?
I would say quite a sizable size. I mean, like Representative and Council Member mentioned earlier, there's definitely more in the movement, more white people involved. There's also more API folks involved in the Twin Cities. And, I definitely hear more from the Hmong community, more calls for solidarity from the Hmong community, and more specifically from the younger folks. There is definitely a generational divide. There is still quite a lot of anti-Blackness within the API community. But I'm also hearing more calls for more solidarity as well, and calling in and calling out each other in that way.
Okay. Well, I noted earlier that there has historically been tensions between African Americans and Asian Americans, as you all have noted. Those became very evident, as I mentioned earlier, during the Rodney King riots. And remember back in 1992, those riots. And for those of you who don't remember, you youngins, Rodney King was an African-American motorist who was beaten by Los Angeles police officers. The officers were tried and they were acquitted, which then spurred all these protests. They were acquitted of using excessive force. And what happened to him seems so much more tame in comparison to what we see in videos these days, and obviously what happened to Mr. Floyd. Some might say we haven't come that long of a way when it comes to police brutality, but I'm wondering if you think we have made a lot of progress, a little progress, no progress in race relations, particularly in how our Asian American Pacific Islander communities now see race relations in our country. And I want to stick with you, Representative Vang, with the older generations, for example. I don't know, your parents, grandparents, have their thinking about race relations, about African Americans or Latinos or anybody else that might look different from them, have they changed while they've been living in the U.S. and how do you think that has changed?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk a little bit about the Hmong American perspective. When the Hmong community first arrived to the United States, to Minnesota, it was about 40 years ago in the 80s, 90s. And that was a time where there was a lot of overt racial tensions. And when we arrived, we were in poverty-ridden neighborhoods, along with our Black neighbors and brown neighbors. And that was a time where our parents and the elders didn't really have the greatest relationship with our Black and brown neighbors. There was a lot of racial tensions. And for us younger folks, we got the privilege and opportunity to go to school and educate ourselves and understand the systems that we're in that continues to oppress us. And we were able to step out of that environment ourselves as well. And so, there's that generational divide. And I would say to young folks that when we talk to our elders and our parents about, when they're making anti-Black comments or responses, that we be more compassionate and understanding about the sort of historical relationships or tensions they've had with coming to America when they first came here. And also reminding everyone that we also have a shared history. The civil rights movement, the fight for freedom is also the reason why the Hmong community have came to America is due to our fight for freedom as well. And I think that's just something that we have to continually remind folks.
Representative Kulkarni, I'm wondering about your own background here. You said you were born in India. By the way, I was born in the Philippines. I'm an immigrant too. And I had a lot to learn. You know, I came here when I was very young at 4, but I grew up in Hawaii where there aren't all that many African Americans. I'm wondering how, you know, again, I don't know how old you were when you arrived, but I'm wondering.
No comment.
I'm sorry?
No comment.
But I'm wondering what kind of education did you have, you know, what kind of learning did you have to do to get a broader understanding of race relations and the communities that you represent?
Yeah, I think I have a little bit of a unique perspective, even in the Indian community in Kentucky. You know, and I completely echo everything the councilman had said, because we are held up as a model minority, because a lot of the first exposure folks have to Indians and Pakistanis is physicians. So your doctor, especially in rural areas, your doctor is going to be Indian or Pakistani. But, you know, and it's just your first exposure to an immigrant, maybe your first exposure to a brown person. I mean, these are small towns all around Kentucky. And that's, so that we didn't have to overcome, right, any kind of negative stereotype. It was whatever other stereotypes were going on. But because it's this healthcare situation, especially with COVID now, people tend to have respect and, you know, tend to look at our community as good people trying to help other folks. But, you know, we didn't come over as physicians. So my dad was not a physician. My brother had learning disabilities. So we moved to Louisville from India so he could go to a DePaul school here. That's why we moved. And it wasn't, he was a businessman. He left a great, you know, executive position, and they didn't have anything. They couldn't come here and find a job. They had degrees, they spoke English, they were, you know, highly trained. My mom had degrees as well. No jobs when we came here. We moved to Louisville in '86. And so they bought a grocery store. They, you know, saved, so they had to use our savings and borrowed some money, bought this small corner grocery store in what's Germantown, which actually was, you know, where all the German immigrants lived. And at that time, it was still predominantly descendants. So older white German folks lived there, and their, you know, kids and grandkids. And so that was our exposure, you know, and they welcomed us. We, you know, there was a gun that was there under the counter, but my dad got rid of it, and folks really just looked out for us, even back then. So I think what has shaped my understanding of race relations, not only with our Indian community, because we don't necessarily relate to everybody who came over as physicians or engineers either, because we really had to, you know, my parents really had to build that up. And I went into politics, which is not sort of normal, the normal course. It is becoming more normal, but that has really helped me see the value in where people come from, right? Not just the country you come from, but what is your experience with white folks, Black folks, other immigrants, and that has really, that's the reason I'm doing what I'm doing now. I think if I hadn't had that experience early on, you know, I may not be here.
Okay. Well, Councilman, I'm wondering if you can talk about the generational divide within your own community, and how the conversations about race might be developing within your community.
Yeah, so when we say my community, I should really narrow it and talk about the Vietnamese community. I won't speak for Asians in Silicon Valley broadly, but I will say that the Vietnamese American community is susceptible to, the elders are susceptible to conspiracy theories. I've received emails, you know, saying that, oh, Mr. Floyd was a victim of COVID, and maybe he died because of COVID reasons, and it wasn't really the 9 minutes on his neck that killed him. I've heard comments about something about the police officers took the body and put it in the back seat of a police car, and who knows where it went. It wasn't in an ambulance properly, and I believe the funeral was closed casket. There's no body. And this is perhaps, you know, some sort of ploy or plan to hurt President Trump in re-election, and things of that nature. So that's out there, and people are sharing the emails. There's not a lot of skepticism to that. I mean, people just read it and they go, well, it's all objective. And
well, you need to read the Associated Press more often.
Right, and so that's out there, and it takes patience on my part, and I'm sure a lot of other young Vietnamese Americans talking to their elders to combat that, to engage and kind of respectfully have a dialogue, because the alternative is just to say, are you kidding me, or are you joking, and getting into an unproductive shouting match, or and it's not helpful, because you're not changing anybody's mind on the point. You're just kind of getting angry at each other, right? And really, when confronted with that, I feel I try to listen. I try to see what they feel is right, and I try to add facts to the discussion and to challenge some notions, but not to really get in an all-out mindset where I'm dismissing them out of hand. And because I think that's dangerous. I think dismissing that out of hand pushes people back into our corners, and it doesn't change anybody's mind, and it's not helpful to a dialogue. And I think I am fortunate to the extent that I can speak Vietnamese fluently, and I'm able to engage in language in a more sophisticated way than many of my peers in my age group, who probably could not engage in this kind of conversation about race relations, about COVID, and about politics in Vietnamese. And so when you do it in English with somebody who's elder and can't engage in English, there's certainly a language barrier to overcome as well.
Okay. Now let's shift gears a little bit. I mean, we're caught in two pandemics in a way, right? Racism being one of them, and the coronavirus being the other. Within the AAPI communities, the dual outbreaks of racism and COVID-19 seem to be one in the same. City Councilman, I'm wondering if you can describe how the coronavirus has impacted your, the Vietnamese community, but more broadly, the Asian American community in the Bay Area, and how, Asian Americans have come under scrutiny and perhaps discriminatory treatment.
Yeah, sure. So there are definitely, economic indicators that have shown that the economic downturn happened within the Asian community sooner than the wider community. Even before we were officially ordered to shut down on March 16th, people were already reluctant to go to a Chinese restaurant for dinner, or to order Vietnamese takeout, because there was some fear of some association with COVID, right? So the Asian community is certainly taking it on the chin, not just figuratively, but also, there have been people, yelling racial slurs at Asian people, go back to China. I've had people, send me private Facebook messages, go back to China. And so that's certainly happening. And during the shutdown, just the nature of it, the fact that we have to be physically distanced from each other, it is disproportionately impacting personal care businesses, hair salons and nail salons. And, depending on where you're at, I would say the Vietnamese community owns the nail salon industry, at least in California. I would say 95% of nail salons in California are Vietnamese run. And so we're allowing certain, white collar offices to open. We're allowing grocery stores to open, of course, outdoor dining at restaurants, but still not yet. And we're today, I believe, 108 days in Santa Clara County during our shutdown. And that's 108 days that if you're a manicurist, you haven't been able to go to work. You haven't been able to earn a living. And so that is top of mind for me, because the Asian community is facing the racial element of this, but also the economic impact of it very deeply.
Yeah. Now, Representative Kulkarni, if you delve into the statistics and demographics of the coronavirus, it's impacted communities of color quite a bit. In Chicago, blacks die at a higher rate than whites. Nationally, blacks have an infection rate of 5 times that of whites. Latinos have 4 times the infection rates. But unfortunately, the CDC does not have any statistics for APIs, which might be a long-standing problem in data collection. Where APIs aren't always studied. In fact, sometimes we are afterthoughts. 2 questions. One, it has to do with why we don't seem to get the attention, and your thoughts about the discrepancies in infections among people of color and the general population. And again, I have no idea where API stand, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm. I'll start with the impact of COVID in terms of communities of color. And I think, again, this is just highlighting the fact that, there are food deserts where you can't, a person can't go get healthy, fresh food. And so you have deficiencies and your immune systems are compromised, and there's lifestyle issues. And people always say, well, you can choose to eat better, but if you can't get the food, you can't afford the food, that's an issue. And I'm just using food as an example. You have a lot of issues, again, living in these areas where you might not be able to get clean water. I mean, we're in 2020 and there's still communities, in the city. So you have it in rural Kentucky, you have it in places in Louisville as well, where people aren't able to get actual drinkable water. And it's things like that are going to, all of it, by itself are just, they're smaller little details, but taken together, it's going to impact you, right? More. When something like this happens, you're going to be more vulnerable. And you've also got folks that in Kentucky, our governor, shut down gatherings. So when we were, and it wasn't even a sort of lockdown shutdown, it was more of a suggestion. There was not necessarily an enforcement of it. And churches sued. And, so you've got this cultural thing too, where it's like, you can't tell me to wear a mask. You can't tell me I can't go to church. And so, folks that are doing that are also putting themselves at greater risk for whatever reason. I don't know the statistics on whether or not that's primarily white churches or Black churches, but I do know that everything, is connected. It's not just silos of poverty and violence and things, and generational and geographic things. It's all together. And I think what's unique about this pandemic is that we see that now, that it's not just this one little detail over here that you can't get, fresh greens. It's not just this issue that you can't get water. It's not this issue that you can't get to a doctor in time, or that EMS doesn't come to your neighborhood quickly enough to prevent a death. It's all of these things. And one other thing is, African Americans are, sickle cell disease. They're obviously more vulnerable to that. And that's something that I don't think has been studied, but I've raised this question because it was brought to me by an African American constituent. And so all of those things, I think, is why you're seeing a disparate impact, because you've got people that are able to get healthcare, able to get nutrition, able to get, transportation to and from, get more preventable things taken care of in the white community, and in, frankly, richer communities. We're talking about socioeconomics more than color. Because, you've got Asian communities that are doing fine as well. And to that point, the census, this is a very important year for the census. And we're not, it's always been kind of Black, white, other, then they added Black, white, Native American, they've been adding these categories, but Asian is still it's just Asian, every kind of Asian. And I think if we don't respond in terms of, you can write in like, I'm Indian, I'm Pakistani, I'm Filipino, I'm Vietnamese, I'm Hmong, and that there's a push. I think that, the Census Bureau is trying. They've got a ton of different languages. And I'm bringing up the census because it also, there was a point made about, so tell me if I'm going over long, but the census and to the point of folks just being able to come here has been used to restrict immigration to the US, right? So in terms of racial makeup, we wanted only folks from Northern Europe, and it was Western Europe. And not until 1965, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, this is kind of getting off topic, but it was also the Immigration Act of 1965 that opened it up to other countries that were not predominantly white. And so that all of that taken together I think you're going to see different folks in different communities being impacted by those types of historical occurrences.
Looks like time is running out, but let me get in another COVID question to Representative Vang and the city councilman. I'm wondering within the Hmong community in Minnesota, how much outreach, how much help has your community gotten to be educated about, the do's and don'ts about COVID and contact tracing or anything like that might help protect your community? Or are those resources not getting there where it needs to go?
Both. We're doing so much more work, and yet the resources are not there, are not getting through. And as I believe the government should be a safety net at the very minimum for people, especially right now when we are in a pandemic. This is the time where government needs to step up, and it has shown that government has failed to be accessible to these communities, especially our API communities, especially to communities of color. And for me, as a legislative color, as who happen to be a Hmong descent, even though I only represent Brooklyn Center, Brooklyn Park, and First Ring of suburbs, the Hmong community has called my office from all over the state because I'm Hmong and because I'm able to speak fluently Hmong and be able to identify resources for them. I have to work harder than the rest of my other colleagues who aren't able to have that kind of language skill or outreach or platform with their constituencies. And so it's been a lot more work for me. As chair of the MAP caucus, we have worked more to reach out to our API communities, whether that's coming out to ethnic media, to pushing our administration to build relationship partnerships with our ethnic medias, to provide translation materials. We had to work that much harder to even bridge that gap. And yet still we are still behind. And now that we're in a pandemic, we are rushing. We are scrambling to reach as far as wide as possible for our constituencies. And it's been tough, but it is the work that we have to do. And we must pursue and persevere.
Well, Representative, let me throw that same question to Councilman Diep, and then I'm going to go to a question from the audience. So.
Sure. So we in Santa Clara County are very fortunate. We have, I think, the one congressional area that's the Asian majority. And here in Santa Clara County, we're slow at first, but we now offer free testing for COVID-19 across the county at various sites. We were the first in the country to order a shelter-in-place order. And so we've been on top of it, and we're also, only beginning to reopen. We haven't been in a rush to do it. So to the extent that people have been hurting economically, we've still been relatively safe. And we've done a wonderful job, I have to say, about offering resources and information in various different languages, in Vietnamese, in Chinese, in Tagalog, and in Spanish. And so we've been on top of that. And the only question for me is, do these communities know to look at our government social media channels to get that information? But if they're looking for it, it's certainly there.
All right. Well, I'm going to ask a question from the audience, and I'm just going to read it straight off. So forgive me if I'm not wearing my contacts. So some Black Lives Matter activists blame Asians or people of Asian descent for being a complicit party in police brutality, pointing out the full Asian officer in Floyd's case. However, they fail to point out the Black Filipino officer as he passes for a POC, person of color. Is this anti-Asian sentiment? Same when Peter Leong got charged when his white counterparts did not get charged. Same with the New York City Chinese judge whose face got posted on social media for letting cops go, and similar sentencing leniency has happened with white judges who make up the majority of the bench. I guess, is there a anti-Asian sentiment that got spawned from the George Floyd case? We touched on it a little bit earlier, but have you noticed any anti-Asian sentiments from these Black Lives Matter incidents? Any of you?
There's certainly been some simplistic comparisons. For instance, there was, in my case, a call to defund the police. And I think that sort of discussion is something we should engage in, but the decision itself needs added context. Police in Kentucky are not police in California. For instance, in Washington, D.C., there's 6 police officers for every 1,000 residents. Here in San Jose, there's only 1.1 officers for every 1,000 residents in San Jose. And so it's a drastic difference. If anything, we are struggling with our police coverage. And so the discussion for that, the council did not opt to cut anything from the police officer's budget. And I got some blowback in comparisons to the officer, I think, Tao in Minneapolis. And so I think those comparisons are unfair. But when people are upset, they immediately make the strongest connection. And they go to that. There was an officer in San Jose that was caught yelling, cursing at protesters in San Jose, and that went viral. And precisely because we're still short on officers, I was of the mind that, well, first, city council can't fire officers, but also I was of the mind that for something like that, cursing, I think discipline and training, but you let the person continue serving if they're capable. And I got a lot of blowback for that. And people said, you're trying to protect this Jared Yuen guy because you're Asians and you're buddies. But I've never met Jared Yuen, and that's not a concern of mine. So I think people are making those comparisons, yes.
Okay. Representative Vang?
Yeah, I think it's always tough when we talk about race to kind of put things in boxes, to say whether it's this or that. I think the other question we have to ask is, like, if it is anti-Asian sentiment, then what's next, right? What good do we get out of it? We say yes, it is, or no, it's not. I think we have to look at the moving piece here that's going to bring us moving forward is what I guess the root causes of anti-Asian sentiment. It's easy for us to get stuck on I don't want to minimize the traumas and the biases and incidents that others experience, but it's also about, how do we keep this conversation moving forward and bring all of us together in moving forward. And I think we have to continue to keep that bigger picture in mind.
This is a question for Representative Kulkarni. Someone wants to know whether or not you've seen more immigrants coming into Kentucky, and how do locals feel about it, and employment prospects and so forth.
Yeah, and this kind of gets to your prior question. One of the things I want to make sure that we do as the Asian AAPI community is understand that this tactic by those in power has been used to divide and conquer those that don't have power. So the Black community and the immigrant community have always been presented as against each other, because Black folks have, the immigrants are coming and taking your jobs, or these low-level jobs, low-paying jobs, and so the immigrants, if you let them in, they're going to take your jobs. Not ever, so you don't stop and think about the fact that why are we getting paid such low wages? Why are there no workplace safety considerations in place? And I think that is kind of where we are in Kentucky. So I mentioned in Louisville, we have for our population a very strong or very large concentration of immigrants, mainly refugees. But you've also seen an explosion since the 90s. So from like 1990 to 2000, the immigrant population doubled, and then 2000 to now it doubled again. So it was fueled a lot by refugees coming in, but also the IT boom. So you had a ton of folks coming from South Asia, from India specifically, because they're coming here as software developers, software engineers, computer programmers, things like that. And so all of a sudden now you see a new wave of immigrants coming primarily from South Asia, not doctors, not engineers, but that are IT folks. And so you also see this in terms of Chinese and Indian STEM students. So they make up the majority of STEM students in the country, and primarily from India and China, those two countries specifically. So you have this, idea again of Asian immigrants versus Hispanic immigrants, Spanish-speaking immigrants coming from Central America, coming from Mexico, and things like that. So now you've got, even within the immigrant community, Hispanics versus Asians, and then you want to pit those against Black people that have, we should be helping Black people. So I've heard this narrative from white people, oh, we shouldn't allow immigrants because it's going to hurt Black people. And not, that's just feeding into this larger narrative of, it's really just keeping those in power indefinitely, because we're all down here kind of fighting amongst ourselves. And so I think that the idea of an immigrant to a non-immigrant depends on where you come from and what you look like. And in this election year, especially with all of the rhetoric surrounding immigration and asylum seekers and how we are treating folks that are so vulnerable, that says a lot about us as a country. And I think the November election is going to be a decision point, an inflection point on where we choose to go as a country.
Well, speaking of direction, first of all, we're over time, but I want to wrap this up with this question about where the three of you will help take your communities. It's great to see so many Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders start getting broader visibility in all areas of society. I personally want to see more journalists of color in our newsrooms because, who best to cover our communities of color than people like us. So as I said, I'm a member of the Asian American Journalists Association. I'm on the board of directors, and go to aaja.org to learn more about us. But I'm wondering about how your individual identities, your life stories, how that's influencing how you want to take your communities as jobs, as public servants, excuse me. I mean, how do you want to move forward? And we'll start with you, Representative Kulkarni.
Sure. I think Representative Vang, has spoken on this a couple of times this evening, but this idea of moving forward together. We have a lot of strife and division in our country that this year feels like it's been a decade. It's been going on forever. We're in July. November is so far away. But I think what we need to understand is that we're not going to be able to move forward unless it is together. And she's absolutely right in that, because cohesiveness and community, I think, are the two things that I'm going to be focusing on in my district and in Kentucky, because we're going to be facing an onslaught of anti-immigrant. Already in my district, you've got this idea of, why am I quarantining at home versus these protesters get to go out and not wear masks, and this whole idea of divisions within divisions within divisions is, I'm seeing more and more of that every day. And Black Lives Matter, or white allies, stay in your lane, so everybody is kind of very hyper focused on, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing, don't step on my toes, or don't encroach, or and then you get these narratives that are spread about immigrants are bringing, like, Kung flu is something our president keeps saying over and over. And so you're in this, really, really difficult place right now. And I think my job as a leader for immigrants as well is to make sure that they are more visible, more vocal, more engaged, so that our community stays together, so that nobody's looking at you and saying, you're brown, I don't know where you're from, you have a weird accent, so I'm dismissing you out of hand, or I'm going to think all of these negative things about you without actually having a conversation with you. I think we need to be very, very careful not to steer into that.
Representative Vang?
I think for me, I have a strong sense of justice in the way that I've grown up. When I think about the story of well, how I've grown up, as a daughter of refugees, growing up in neighborhoods where we didn't have access to, healthy food or, to great parks or opportunities to good schools. I think feeling that sense of injustice growing up and now being able to be at the table and make decisions that govern people's lives. It's that sense of justice I feel that I don't want my children or any children to go through. And so that's, coming from the lens that I do in the work at the state. So.
Councilman?
Yeah, so I think my answer is that I want to keep serving as long as the community will allow me to. I grew up as a son of refugees, Vietnamese refugees, boat people, and different than maybe other families. It was a very strong in my family that this idea that we weren't starting over in America, but we were living in exile. And the dream is that one day there's going to be a free Vietnam, a democratic Vietnam. And so until that happens, we're living on borrowed time in America. And it's my job to grow up to learn everything I can about democracy and freedom and all the great things America has to offer. And it was my parents' dream and their friends' dream for me to one day go back to Vietnam and help share that with my brothers and sisters there. And I don't know how far off that is, but in the interim, I'm trying to put that knowledge that I've learned about, democracy and majority rules, and also protecting the tyranny of the majority to protect the minority voice that has value as well into government. And as a refugee, or as a American born, but with the mindset of a refugee, I don't try to shape my city in my image, because throughout my life, there were so many things I did for the first time. Applying for college, I didn't know what prom was. I didn't know what homecoming was. I never learned how to throw a football spiral. And so even as an adult, if somebody were to tell me, hey, Lund, you're doing this wrong, like Americans do it differently, I would pause and I would consider that, because I don't have this sense of I know what I'm doing. Not completely, not yet. And so I try to be as thoughtful as possible. I try to listen, and I try to dig deep on the policy issues and try to arrive dispassionately at the best outcome possible. And I take that responsibility seriously. And I think, all levels of government should reflect our communities, should reflect the communities we represent. And we have voices to share, and government needs to know what we know.
And I am sorry, but there is one more question from a audience member here who wants to know how we overcome the dismissive attitudes regarding all the many anti-Asian racism, the ever-prevalent Asian stereotypes, deferential, asexual, passive, etc., and the general ignorance around the persistent exclusion and marginalization of Asian Americans. Whoever wants to take that first. Anyone? Since we've got the councilman already on screen, at least on my screen, why don't you start?
How do we overcome it? I think, we endure it, and we show that there are different ways of being Asian. I mean, Asian in and of itself it means so many things. There's East Asian, there's Indian, the whole subcontinent. So Asian in itself, the stereotypes are there because we allowed ourselves as a community to be painted a certain way. Asian males are supposedly not masculine.
Wait, I'm going to interrupt you. What do you mean we allow? What do you mean we allow?
Or it happened to us, not so much that we allowed it, we gave permission to, but we were put in a situation where, popular culture portrayed us in a certain way. And in a certain era, we were just happy to have a role to play. We were just happy to be on TV. We were just happy to have pop culture look at us anyway. So we were fine being, the Cato to the Green Hornet. We were fine taking these roles because they weren't available to us to begin with. And so we played to type, we played to expectations, and we didn't really have the opportunity to express ourselves in the full diversity that is, Asian America. And that's beginning to change increasingly. But I really think it's more about, asserting ourselves and being true to ourselves and being brave enough to say no to things that may be seen as opportunities, but you're really just perpetuating a stereotype because it's somebody else's vision of what it means to be Asian and not really reflecting what that is.
Representative Vang, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think this is a question that even I'm still trying to answer myself. I'm actually the youngest female at the state capitol, and in the first Hmong American elected in the state house, and that's something that it comes with great responsibility. Is feel like you have to represent a whole community behind you, and at the same time, you're also a lot of colleagues have never interacted with you before, and so it's a question that I'm still trying to answer myself, and it's not easy, but I think it is something that this is where we reach out to our support system, our support networks, and that we continue to be authentic and to also be vulnerable. And I think that's how we can continue to navigate through this process.
Representative Kulkarni?
I think the councilman brought up an interesting point about pop culture. I grew up with folks asking me if I ate monkey brains because of the Indiana Jones movies, or there was always Apu from The Simpsons. And I think one of the reasons you have situations like that, and that you're seeing a shift in those attitudes, is because you're getting more Asians in those rooms. You're getting more folks entering the arts and in politics and in different fields that are not just the stereotypical fields that our parents and our grandparents entered. And I think those are opportunities to teach people why this is not right, or this is right, or we don't agree, or how it makes us feel when you say something like that. And I think there's a lot more openness now, but we have to be able to take those opportunities when we see them and teach. And it takes a lot of patience, but I think it's going to have to be incumbent on each of us to do that wherever and whenever we can, until we don't have to anymore.
Well, I think the three of you are fine examples of changing the stereotype. And I hope we do that, because it is about time. So Representative Vang, Representative Kulkarni, and Councilman Dieppe, thank you so much for taking part in this conversation. I enjoyed it, learned a lot. And Madeline, back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Bobby, for moderating tonight. And much thanks to all of our panelists, State Rep Kulkarni, State Rep Vang, Councilman Dieppe, for this very thoughtful discussion. As Representative Kulkarni mentioned, more APIs in public service, whether you're a staff person, whether you're an elected official, is so important in this ecosystem that we have that comes about in the formulation of public policy. It's who you have in the rooms to discussing these issues and how it impacts our communities, and having diverse people in that room allows us to be sure that those perspectives are being told. And that is what we do at APEX. We are here to help make sure that we are a resource to the AAPI community and learning how to be elected, learning the skills to be able to get through your first election. So we have wonderful programs at apaics.org that you can log on to see how you can participate from the high school level, college level, your first time as a candidate, mid-career level as a staffer. And so we hope to see more of you in participating in these programs. I also want to take the opportunity to thank the API Vote staff, the APEX team, for all their work in organizing this tonight. And if anything, when you're thinking about the next action item for this year, please remember to take the census, encourage others to also fill it out, and to vote, because that is our power, being able to go to the polls and be able to issue our vote. And so have a good evening and enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you all.
Thank you.